to another episode of the Redeemed Man podcast. I'm Nate Dewberry, director of the Redeemed, and we're thrilled to continue our discussion around leadership. We've released a couple of podcast episodes, and we're going to continue tonight with Cal Walters. Cal is passionate about helping leaders grow. He founded Intentional Leader and is the host of the Intentional Leader podcast. He's also a major in the U.S. Army and currently serves as the associate professor at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School in Charlottesville, Virginia. He's married to Natalie, and they have two beautiful kids. Cal's a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, Campbell Law School, U.S. Army Ranger School, and the U.S. Army Airborne School. Prior to attending law school, Cal served as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army, where he led a rifle platoon, served as the second in command of an infantry company, was deployed to Iraq, and served as an aide-de-camp for an Army general. Cal, welcome to the show, and thank you for your service to our country.
Nate, I am honored to be here. This is going to be fun.
Definitely going to be fun. I'm looking forward to this. I love leadership, love talking about it. You have invested a lot of time and have talked to some amazing leaders. I definitely encourage our audience, if you're looking for leadership podcast that is one of the best out there, check out Intentional Leader. Cal does a great job interviewing guests and has a wide range of leaders on his podcast. So I've enjoyed it. My wife and I listen to it quite frequently. So thank you for what you do. And we looking forward to jumping in today to talk a little bit more about leadership. We typically start with some random fun questions just so our audience can get to know you and kind of start it off a little bit light just to get comfortable. So we'll jump right in. What's one of your favorite books, Cal?
Oh, man. Well, first of all, thank you. It's weird being on the other side of this. I have to admit, I enjoy asking the questions. I don't know if I enjoy quite as much answering the questions, but one of my favorite books is this is in the last couple of years, and we'll probably talk some about this, but it's The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. It's a book that is just, the title gives it away. Just the idea of trying our best to eliminate. He talks about hurry sickness. We struggle in our society with distraction, and I think it's a book that really spoke to me at a particular moment in time. And we could talk more about that, but that is a book. That's the first book that came to mind when you asked me that. So it's one of those books that's resonated deeply.
I look forward to hearing more because I know if your life is like most people that serve in the Army, it is quite busy. So learning how to set aside time to be still is definitely a practice to develop.
Yeah. And I think it's something that most people I would imagine struggle with today. I think it's unique to our time. So I think there's a lot of folks that are listening that could probably relate to the idea of busyness and what that does to our souls, really.
No doubt. What is one of your most treasured memories?
Oh, most treasured memories. The first thing that comes to mind when my wife and I celebrated our 10-year anniversary, we went to Switzerland, and we just did this epic trip. Spent way too much money, but it was my wife's first time ever being in Europe. And for those that have spent time traveling in Europe, I just think it's unique, and it was so much fun to watch her experience Europe for the first time in general, and then both of our first times in Switzerland. And it was just magical. I mean, it was fun because that was probably, at that point, was 5 years into having a kid. And it was probably the first week plus long trip we took since having a kid. So it was just some real quality time. So that is a special memory. And hopefully we can have another one of those before too long. Now we're knee deep in a 19-month-old. And it's just, that seems like something that's far off in the distance, but hopefully not too far.
Hopefully not. Switzerland's gorgeous. Definitely a place that everybody should get to go, but you better have your pocketbook ready.
Yes, that's what we learned. We're like, oh wow, maybe we could have done this a little bit cheaper. Maybe Canada's we'll find something a little closer next time. Maybe Austria. But yeah, it was great.
What is something that people would never guess about you?
Mm, something people would never guess about. One of the things that's always a bit funny. So I have this is embarrassing to share, but why not?
Thank you.
I hate mayonnaise. I don't know why. It's so random. People that know me like quickly learn because it's difficult sometimes when people are like, "Hey, what do you not like?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't really like mayonnaise," but at the same time, it's not really an allergy, but I'll probably gag if it's in the thing. So um, most people would be like, "Ah, I didn't know that about you," but it is a thing in our life. And my wife, interestingly, doesn't like cheese, so we're probably one of the hardest couples to cook for because I don't
I
like
would
mayonnaise,
think
she doesn't like
so.
cheese. Um, but the more I've learned about mayonnaise, like what's actually in it, the more I've learned. Okay, maybe it's not that bad, but I still have a a, a a desire not to ever put it in my mouth. So,
You and my father would get along. He hates mayonnaise and does not understand why anybody would like it. So
oh,
completely
my
completely get
people. I
that.
love it. It's funny. The more I share that, the more I do run into people that are like, "Oh yeah, me too, man. I hate it."
Now your
Makes me feel
wife
better.
not liking cheese, I'm not so sure about that one.
Yeah. Okay, good. So you think that's actually weirder? Okay, good. I'll let her
That
know.
one to me is weird. I love cheese. All kinds of cheese.
I do
Goat
too. I love
cheese.
cheese.
I mean,
Yeah.
gosh.
Yes. Yeah.
If you could meet anybody in the world today, who would you want to meet?
Mm. It would have been Tim Keller. Uh, I would have just loved to
Yeah.
sat down with him. In fact, when he passed away, I got very emotional. I feel like Tim Keller in the last 3 or 4 years has been such a mentor. Not I don't know Tim Keller, never didn't know him personally, but just I've probably listened to hundreds of his sermons, and they've helped me with my doubts. They've helped me navigate some of the complexities of life, relationally, skepticism. Um, so even though he recently passed, he would be my guy. I would just man to be able to just sit and just ask him questions and just let him share the depth of wisdom that he's cultivated over time would be fun. That would be a treasure.
No, that would be a great one. His his writings, his sermons, all I could not agree more. Just he's very genuine and gentle, even in his delivery, and yet very thought provoking. And even in his depth of wisdom and theology, I always thought he was able to communicate in a very bottom shelf kind of way that
Yeah,
anybody could receive it.
I agree.
That
Yeah,
that's awesome.
it was sad to see him pass. I was actually surprised by how emotional I got, which is kind of
Hmm.
odd for someone you don't know. I think I just spent so much time. I love to
Yeah.
run, and so he would often be my companion on runs, and uh, it was like someone passing away that I actually knew, even though I never actually met him.
Hmm.
He just marked me so much.
Wow. Well, switching gears a little bit more, a little bit. What's your you've already said this one. I was about to ask what's your all-time favorite dream vacation, but I think you probably have answered that in talking about Switzerland. Is there anywhere you have it been you'd like to go?
Well, I was gonna say what I would love to do. I did get a chance to go to Israel with my wife. Or no, I'm sorry. I got a chance to go to Israel right after I graduated college with some friends. It was amazing. I would love to go to Israel with my wife and just ideally have a month.
Yeah.
Probably ambitious, probably unrealistic that would ever happen in life to have that much time. But that would be fun to just walk and just kind of soak in that area with my wife and to be able to share. I think I don't know. It was a great experience after college, but I think my relationship with God and with Jesus, even though in college I had really been a Christian for over 10 years.
Hmm.
I feel like the last 5 years has been almost like a new beginning for me in my
Yeah.
walk with Jesus. And so I think it would mean more to me now than it did 15 years ago when I went. And it would be neat to share with my wife. So that would be my dream is at some point to go do that together.
Well, hopefully you'll be able to make that dream come true sooner than later. Um, Cal, I know being a leader, you have daily habits. I'm certain of that. What is a daily habit that you feel like is like happens every day and you are the most thankful that's a part of your life?
Hmm. Well, I do love to think about this. So I will start with one that's not probably the first thing you think about, and that is I love my coffee. So I start my day first thing with I recently I do like a Chemex, which is actually kind of labor intensive in the morning. So I'll do like
Yeah.
I grind the beans the night before. I have my pour over in the morning. But the key is while I'm doing that, I'm praying and I'm just kind of starting my day. I try not to look at my phone until after I've just had some time to just be with God in the morning. And so I try to start my day just welcoming God into my mind, into my spirit, and just Lord, thank you for this day. Good morning, Father. Good morning, Jesus. Good morning, Holy Spirit. Um, and so I think one of the disciplines that I've tried to cultivate, and I'm imperfect at it, is just kind of slowing down. It's kind of
Yeah.
starting. I think a lot of us, the first thing we do, our alarm goes off, we look at our phone, and the next thing we know, there's a stress that we have the stimulus is already we're in the world, social media, we're in email, we're responding to a text, or we're already distracted by the news. So I really like to start my day with a distraction-free moment, and that's normally about the first 30 minutes of the day, just trying to have my coffee, have some time in prayer, have some time just in quiet, start read the word is normally my the first 30 minutes. I'm just hopefully in the word with my journal. And then ideally, my kids have not woken up, so it's probably about an hour before my family wakes up. And I love to go for a run. And I've already kind of mentioned it, but I just really enjoy getting outside, running, uh, and then I'll come back, and it's like at that point my family's kind of waking up. So those little habits, I think, have those are kind of my ideal day. It kind of sets me
Yeah.
on a course. Um, yeah, so I'll stop there, but those are some habits kind of as I'm beginning my day that I find to be helpful to kind of get my attention on God and not allowing the world to get my attention on other things to
Yeah.
start my day.
Great practices. What time of the morning do you normally wake up?
I used to get up probably way too early. I used to be like a 5 a.m. guy, probably even earlier than that. I've started to focus a lot more recently on my sleep, and I'll let myself sleep till 6:30, and that typically still allows me probably six is probably the ideal time because 6 a.m. gives me time to do all of have that 30 minutes of coffee, prayer, time in the Word, and then if I'm out the door running by 6:30, that puts me back at about 7:15, and that's typically around the time that everybody's waking up.
I'm impressed that if you get that 19 month to stay in the bed to 7:15, you guys are doing good. You must be keeping him
Well,
up
he's
late.
he's still not sleeping through the night though, most nights. So that's I think we've got a lot of I think we could use some coaching. So if anyone out there can help us with getting him to sleep through the night, that would be nice. But I have taken over the night shift now that Natalie's not nursing anymore. Um, so that's probably part of why I'm sleeping in a little bit later
Yeah,
than I used to.
definitely. If you don't get a good night's sleep and you can't sleep through the night, I can imagine wanting to sleep a little bit longer being very good for you.
Yeah,
So
and that's
Cal,
another what is and just real quick. Speaking of habits, and one thing that I've that time at night is interesting because there's no distractions. I don't have my phone. It's just me, and I'm often rocking him and just kind of talking to God and just kind of crying out to God and just giving God my worries, my fears. Because often at night when I'm rocking him, all of a sudden all the things that I have to do the next day, I'm thinking about that and just and I think, and I know Nate, I know your heart is for men, and I think as men, we probably don't do that enough. Just kind of unburdening ourselves. to
Yeah.
the Father who loves us and cares about us. So that's another habit that I try to do more of is as I feel my stress levels rise, as I feel myself taking on the weight of whatever's in my life, trying to just kind of unburden myself and actually give it to God. And kind of looking at the Psalms. The Psalms are a wonderful example of us for us of how to pray. And so much of the Psalms is just lament. It's just raw. Hey, you know what? I'm frustrated. I'm tired. I'm stressed out. I don't have an answer. And so I think I'm learning to do more of that. And I think men probably especially struggle with that.
Oh, I love that you mentioned the Psalms. One of my favorite. It's always been helpful for me because I think early on in my faith, I always wanted to come to God with it, having it all together and learning to really come and talk to God about everything, no matter how I'm feeling, that I'm pouring out my heart. So can completely relate to that. And it's amazing how God gives us sometimes special moments that are unexpected, like those moments in the night when you would think about being asleep, but yet God has those moments of being able for you to be able to connect with Him, which is so rich. So Kel, kind of shifting a little bit, I would love to go back to tell us a little bit about how you grew up, your family, how you ended up at West Point, just a little bit of your backstory, because we talked a little bit in your introduction more about kind of who you are post graduation at West Point and your career and what you do with intentional um, leaders. So take me back, growing up, what was that like for you, and how did you end up at the military academy?
It's funny because I never envisioned myself being in the military. I didn't have any family members that were in the military other than my grandfather who served in World War II, but I didn't even get a chance to meet him. So if you were to tell me, God, I'm 16 years in now, if you were to tell me that, at age 37, you'd be, on the downside of your career in the Army, I would never have believed you. So I grew up in South Carolina. My family, I kind of come from a family of teachers on one side, and on my dad's side, construction workers and kind of the residential space. But my parents got divorced when I was 4, and so that marked my journey significantly. And they got divorced, and then about a year or two later, they married what would become my stepfather and my stepmother. And I was an only child, and then became now I was on one side because my stepmother had 2 kids and my stepfather had 2 kids. So I was on one side the middle child, and on the other side I was the oldest. And so that also made me, that was a unique experience for me because
Yeah.
I was almost probably a different person with each family. I was, over here I'm kind of the middle child, and I've got my stepmom, and on the other side I'm the oldest, and it's my mom, and so I was constantly kind of bouncing back. But both wonderful families, but that was, a part of my experience. And my stepfather was an Episcopal priest, and so we grew up in South Carolina. But then around the age of, I guess it would have been 7th grade, he got a new church out in North Carolina, and so our family was going to move to North Carolina. And so that was a significant moment in my life where at that point, my whole family, my whole life was in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Um, and so that sparked kind of a difficult moment. And so at that point, my family, there was a little bit of a custody dispute over who I was going to live with. Would I live with my dad back in South Carolina, or would I live with my mom in North Carolina? And it was interesting, and this kind of gets a little bit into my faith journey. Around that time, I was kind of struggling with who I was, I think, because we had just moved. I ended up moving to North Carolina, and I got in with a crowd of people that were new. I was the new guy. I'd never been the new guy, and I started to kind of experiment with some drugs, not marijuana really, and some
Yeah.
alcohol. And long story short, I ended up getting suspended from 8th grade. So it was towards the end of my 8th grade year for having drugs at middle school, marijuana. And that suspension was going to be for the first semester of my ninth grade year.
Hmm.
And so pretty significant. Obviously, again, my stepdad's the local priest in this kind of small town. Not a great look for him when his, stepson's getting suspended from high school. And I think that was a significant moment, or I know that was a significant moment for me. And I ended up going to this youth conference with my church where there was a guy speaking. His name was Daryl Scott, and he was the father of Rachel Scott. Rachel Scott was killed in Columbine, the shooting in Colorado, and she was this incredible girl. And I had never heard of anyone having that kind of relationship with Jesus. She was walking with Jesus. She was journaling. She was reading. She was loving on people at her high school. She was actively going out and trying to sit with people who were marginalized. And on that day that those two students came into the high school, they looked at her, they pointed a gun in her face, and they said, as long as you reject Jesus, we'll let you live. And she said, no, I can't do that. And they ended up killing her. But the way her dad talked about her story and just that kind of relationship, anyway, for the first time in my life, even though I'd kind of grown up in the church, I felt that there was something that I was missing. And so that night I gave my life to Christ. And so that would have been right around the summer before my ninth grade year. And man, it's crazy how my life switched like full 180 in terms of my focus, my perspective, my path. And so I went from being this kid who was on marijuana, confused, suspended, to all of a sudden refocusing. And the crazy thing is, ended up my senior year getting into West Point. And so there was a long path in between ninth grade to my senior year where I became the student body president, the class president, the captain of the football team, getting looked at all these colleges to play football. And that's actually how I ended up finding out about West Point. Is they sent me some letters, and I thought I was being like hardcore recruited, but it turns out I think they just probably send a lot of these letters to a lot of people that play football. So I ended up having to apply through the normal channels and got in. And then once I got in, I was like, oh gosh, I should probably go. And it was a great experience. And West Point taught me a lot about leadership, and that's probably where I began. I would say football, being a captain of the football team, and kind of leading in the church community in my high school, and then leading in the kind of the student body arena, combined with going to West Point is probably that's why I got so pumped about leadership and why I started to really get passionate about the study of leadership. And that's ultimately, I think, why I started Intentional Leader, the podcast, and the organization. Sorry, that's a lot,
Well,
but that's kind of the quick backstory.
no, Cal, I really appreciate you going through so much of your story. I mean, I think one of the things that we really want to focus on with the Redeemed is the fact that we all come from broken stories. Even if your dad isn't or stepdad's an Episcopal priest, we have stuff, we have things in our life. And
Yeah.
part of that is being able to share that and be able to let people know that, no matter where we come from, there are challenges that we're facing. There are things that we're navigating. There are even the best leaders have their things that are weaknesses that they're working through. And so thank you for kind of journeying through your story, and really cool to see how God had his hand on you at an early age. With that, I would love to ask you, which we ask every guest because of our name, the Redeemed, is what does redemption mean to you personally? And having really had a transformation in your life at an early age, and even you talked about with me of how you've really grown in the last few years. It may have an even deeper meaning since then, but what does redemption mean for you?
I love that question. I think more than anything, redemption and the gospel, they go hand in hand. Well, the good news, and I love the way Tim Keller frames it to kind of bring it back to where we began. And he says that we are more sinful and flawed than we ever dared believe, and yet at the same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus than we ever dared hope. And he would often talk about kind of holding those two realities at the same time. Like you can't really when it comes to the gospel, it's not either or. They're both true, but they're true at the same time. Another way that he would frame it in another one of his sermons is, we're known to the depths of who we are, and yet we're loved to the sky. And so that's what it means to me, to be fully known and yet fully loved. And it doesn't mean that to be fully known and loved doesn't mean fully accepted in terms of all my mess is good.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like with a marriage. I mean, that's one of the things I've realized with my marriage to Natalie, is there's something so beautiful about someone knowing you and seeing you at your worst and yet still loving you. I mean, that's the story of the gospel, is
It's the gospel.
Jesus. God makes himself known to us through Jesus and sees us and all of our ugliness, and yet still does what Jesus did. And so I don't know. To me, that's ultimately what it means to be redeemed. And but at the same time, it's a process of becoming more and more over time like Jesus. So I think one thing that has probably shifted in my journey more than anything is I think I grew up in a tradition where we spent a lot of time talking about the moment of conversion. And I think that's a really important moment to talk about. But I think what wasn't talked about enough is the period of formation that takes place after that. And that's what I think has helped me shift in the last 5 years, of just starting to realize that Jesus doesn't just speak to that, what happens when we become a new creation through belief in Christ, but there's so much that Jesus calls us into to become more like him over time. And it's not a quick process, but it's a long formation process in community that is actually what leads to human flourishing. And I think
Yeah.
we don't talk about that enough, is that I think that we have all these narratives in our, especially men, we have all these belief systems that ultimately guide the way we operate in the world. We have these things that we believe are true, and then therefore we orient our life around them. So for example, if we think at our depths that wealth and position and power is going to fulfill my soul, then I'm going to orient my life around those things. And that's a truth that I'm believing. And Jesus offers us a perspective on the good life, and we can either believe it and orient our life around it. He talks about in Matthew and the other gospels about building our house on a solid foundation and how the storms come and the winds blow. But when we form our life on him, then we have something solid. And so anyway, I know I'm kind of rambling here, but I think another part of redemption to me is the formation over time into becoming more a person of agape type love.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, hopefully at the end of our lives, we look a whole lot more like Jesus than we do now.
Yeah. Hopefully so. I think that's the beautiful picture of the transformation of the gospel, that it really is a process of being transformed and changed. And we get to participate with God and through, the Holy Spirit's work in our life to change and transform us, and to hopefully, like you said, reflect more of Jesus and how we live each and every day. Thinking of that in context of leadership, how has your growth as a believer and Christ follower influenced and impacted the way you lead?
Yeah, it's probably impacted me in ways that I am aware of, and in ways that I'm not. I mean, I think Jesus is the ultimate leader. He is the example of leadership in how he and there's the ways that we know, right? I think he washed people's feet. When we think of servant leadership, we often think about some of the things he said. It's the greatest among you is the servant among you. But I think beyond that, he was very effective as a leader. I mean, he took the time to see things in other people that they couldn't see in themselves. Peter, just a fisherman who was probably struggling with a little bit with some anger, it seems, and he calls Peter into something. He gives him a vision for a better life. He helped him see more, dream more, do more, and then ultimately be more than Peter ever would have been on his own. And I think that's really what leaders do. I mean, to me, leadership is ultimately about stewardship. It's about kind of helping people, organizations, and things and teams just make them better than how you found them. And so, um, and then I think another way that my faith kind of impacts my leadership is just, I think a lot more about legacy. I probably think on a longer term. I think kind of eternal impact a lot of times, where I think it's real easy. I can imagine without that perspective, it's maybe a little bit more of a short-term focus of, hey, how do we get this job done? How do we execute on these tasks, and maybe forget some of the human dimension and the impact. It's real easy for, I think, us as believers to think about the impact we're having on people. And that's ultimately, I think, one of the most important aspects of leadership.
When you think about Christ and his leadership and the impact, it's really amazing too, of the whole model of taking a few guys and really pouring into those and seeing
Yeah.
them in turn pour into others, and that whole principle of the influence that we have and continuing to multiply your influence. And you can't he couldn't be close to everybody, but he could be close to a few, and those few, because they knew him so well, were impacted more than ever by his life. And so they were able to go and really see the gospel spread across the world. And it's just amazing, even when you read the letters of Paul's heart to go to the nations and to share, and thinking about men who are marked by his leadership, and then the model of sacrifice. I think one of the things I often think about with leadership is a lot of people like the thought of being in charge, but they don't understand that with greater leadership, all that the sacrifice that's there and how much it costs to lead at a high level. And I'm sure in your conversations and in your own life, you've seen that. I'd love for you to speak just a moment about kind of what you've learned about the cost of leadership, because I honestly don't think people often talk about it enough. Of, hey, if you're going to get to this level, it means you give up a whole lot of things, and it may look cool of what they're getting to do and the ability that they have, but there's a huge sacrifice and often pain oriented with leadership, especially pastoral or ministry leadership, but leadership in general is painful. I even think about context of military, where, if you are a great leader and caring for your soldiers, the losing men and women and conflict and all that, or even seeing their failure and what that impacts with the pain of leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And I immediately, when you were talking about kind of the cost of leadership, it made me think, are you familiar with Patrick Lencioni's book, The Motive? Have you read that or
Yes.
familiar with that?
Yes.
Yeah, I love, it's a simple little book for those that haven't read it. It's a great quick read, but he talks about the difference between, he's getting at what is your motivation for leaders. And he says way too many leaders have a reward centered motivation for leadership. They're just like, hey, I want to lead. Yeah, great. I get the nice parking job or parking spot. I get the nice car. I want to travel. There's a lot of perks that we think of when we think of positional leadership. But he talks about, like, we don't need more of those kind of leaders, because they leave a lot of bodies behind them. They're just terrible leaders long term. But what we need is people that are responsibility centered leaders, is what he talks about. And so I think, and that kind of goes to the faith component as well. I think it's important for us to check our motivations, and that's one of the beautiful and hard things about following Jesus, is he does care about our motivations. And so if we allow him into that space, he can kind of start to prune away some of our mixed motivations, because none of us are perfect. We have probably a little bit of reward centered in there, a little bit of responsibility centered leadership. But the more you lead, the more you are responsibility focused. You realize that the reward is the impact that you can have on people.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing better to me than, because it does take a lot of work. It takes a lot of emotional availability. It takes a lot of emotional energy to sit with someone and coach them and listen to them and lead people differently. I think the best leaders lead every single person just a little bit differently because they take the time to get to know the people that they're leading. And that takes energy, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes a level of empathy and emotional intelligence that that I think a lot of reward center leaders they're just not going to take the time to do
Yeah.
that. And so, yeah, I think that there is a sacrificial component to leadership. I was actually thinking about Nate the other day. I was listening to a sermon, and it was a sermon about Jesus and the prayer of Gethsemane. You know, he's sitting there about to go to the cross, and he's praying, and he's sweating blood. The Bible describes it, and he just asked his two closest people, "Hey, can you just sit here and pray and just watch out?" And what do? They fall asleep.
Oh,
Then he's so patient with them, and he comes back and he's like, "Okay, can you do it again? I'm going to go pray some more. I'm going to go talk to the Father." And I think that sometimes is the experience of leaders. They invest so much and they try so hard to help people get to a different place,
yeah.
but then sometimes it doesn't work out. And I think that goes back to kind of our earlier point. I think it highlights how the leader has to have something beyond themselves, hopefully a relationship with the Father, but that's where they get their ultimate strength. That's where we see in Jesus, where even when the people he's leading aren't meeting their full potential, they're falling asleep when he's asking them to pray, he's with the Father and he's gaining strength from the Father, and he's staying committed to the vision, Jesus' vision, which was ultimately to fulfill his purpose of dying and then rising again.
Thinking of your own leadership, is there a moment where you that comes to mind where it was very painful, or the cost of your leadership? Do you have a story that in your own personal leadership that comes to mind when you're thinking about the cost of leadership and that pain?
Mm. Yeah, and I think that I'm trying to think of examples where I think as a leader, the first thing I think about is actually not even in the organizational context. It's just the being a father, and we kind of already talked about it, but it's one of the things about being a parent and I guess being a leader in general is you're immediately confronted with your own selfishness.
Yes.
No one when they hear their baby crying at night, and maybe some parents that are better than me, but very few I would imagine are like, "Yes, thank you that you woke me up from a wonderful night's sleep. Let me go and serve you right now." But there's pain, so there's pain, there's
Yeah.
sacrifice in serving that person. And I think some of the pain that I've experienced comes when someone lets me down, where I have invested or spent time with someone, or I feel like I told them enough, gave them enough guidance, gave them enough clarity, and then they don't meet expectation. But here's the key, Nate, I think, and this is not something I do perfectly, but I go back to, I think, Jocko Willink, his book Extreme Ownership. I think the best leaders very quickly orient back to themselves and they say, okay,
Yeah.
what could I have done better?
What can I do?
And so, and often there's a lot there when I start to ask myself that question. Oh man, I could have been clearer. I didn't set that person up for success. I didn't give enough guidance. I didn't train them well enough. And so I immediately think, yeah, I guess in my time as a parent, sacrifices that go into that, and then those moments in organizational leadership where maybe someone doesn't meet expectations, or even as a team, when there's been moments where as an organization we have failed to meet our higher headquarters expectations, and that's painful because as a leader, if I'm at my best, I'm taking ownership over that, and that's
Yeah.
hard to do. That's hard to in that moment say, you know what, we didn't execute as we should have. I'm going to take a hard look at myself, and I'm going to figure out how we can do this better moving forward. I actually there was a moment I was on an investigation and just kind of thinking of leaders taking ownership. It was a really high profile investigation. I was an attorney at this point. I was a legal advisor on this death investigation. And it was just a minor detail. We were setting up these kind of high profile interviews, and I told the folks that we were interviewing, these were like pretty high profile people, the wrong time. And so we were late. I think me and this general were late to do this interview, and they were quick to point out that, like, hey, so and so Cal here told us the wrong time or whatever. And I'll never forget this senior leader. He Because I was going to, like, very quickly apologize for
Yeah.
what I had done and just completely own, oh yeah, I'm so sorry, I made that mistake. He like physically put his hand on me and said, no, stop. I made that mistake. And it was just like this moment of, like,
Mm.
someone stepping into my mistake
Yeah.
and taking ownership, even though he had nothing to do with it. But I just think he genuinely meant it too. It wasn't like, hey, let me just go through the motions here. And man, there was nothing I wouldn't do for that guy. And I think that's the power of sacrificial leadership, is when leaders will stay later, when they'll serve their team, when they'll sit with their people, when they'll send the written letter, when they'll check up on stuff that they don't have to check up on, when they're kind of, their video matches their audio over time. Man, I think that builds a lot of credibility with people, and I think that's what Jesus did.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you're so quick to jump in and follow somebody that doesn't use their position of leadership, but really models their leadership and models sacrifice and service, that they don't think they're any better due to their position, and they really, you jump to serve them and work for them and come alongside them. And there are very few leaders that are, I think, like that all the time. Which is hard, but yeah, I'm sure you've been around some of those leaders that just stand out in your life. You've been at United States Military Academy, one of the premier institutions in our country and around the world. You've interviewed a lot of influential leaders. Who are some of the people in your own personal life who you really like? They've really influenced you and your leadership style. And again, I know if you're like me, there's a lot of different people that you've taken little tidbits from, but who are the people that you're like, man, I love learning from them. They really are the model and the picture that I want my life to be impacted or modeled after.
Yeah, a few people quickly come to mind. The first one, when you think about West Point, is this guy named Jeff Van Antwerp. He was a major at the time. So when I got to West Point, and it's probably still the same now, there's a lot of pressure, may not be the right word. There's a lot of pushing towards, and I guess highlighting of the infantry branch, because the infantry is the branch when you go into the infantry, you're on the front lines, you're leading soldiers. And before you graduate from West Point, you have to choose your branch. So you could choose aviation, you could choose medical service, you could choose finance. There's all kinds of branches you could choose. And I had no interest in going to infantry. Every infantry officer that I had met at that point had a weird haircut, and they just talked weird. I just felt like they were like these just people I could not relate to. Then enter Jeff Van Antwerp. So Jeff Van Antwerp, he's actually now a general. He came to West Point. It was actually my senior year, right as I was going into my senior year. He was the officer who was in charge, kind of a supervisor of me when I was in a leadership position. So I got to know him, but just picture G.I. Joe. The guy's probably like 6'2", 200 pounds, just rock solid, but could run forever, and had, I think, 5 kids, just incredible family man. They just came from Hawaii. So they were just this, like, perfect kind of like Ken and Barbie couple, but also just like strong faith. Anyway, everyone wanted to be like Major Van, and he would do these workouts where he'd have people out there at like 5 in the morning doing this CrossFit workout, but hundreds of people would show up because they just wanted to be around this guy. And so anyway, but he actually reached out and was kind of a mentor to me during my time at West Point. So he's one of the first leaders I think of, is just someone who, he made me think things were possible that otherwise were not possible. And that was in the physical arena, that was in the family arena, faith arena. I mean, just an incredible leader. So he was just classic led by example. And he was just one of those guys who he didn't just talk about being fit, he modeled it. He didn't just talk about being a man of integrity, he modeled it. And anyway, so that's one of the people that immediately comes to mind. Um, I also think about a guy by the name of Tom Husted. He was another officer that I met in Hawaii, just a great family man, just a real caring individual. And yeah, so I could go on and on, but I will say, one thing, Nate, that I think that leaders, just like me, just like you, we're all a little bit of a mixed bag. And I think the
Yeah.
sooner we appreciate that, and I have in the last several years started to appreciate that more, because sometimes we want to find like we ever since I encountered Major Van Antwerp, I kind of want to find the next like Major Van Antwerp, like who is the guy who's just going to be basically perfect, and that's the guy that will be my mentor. But when we do that, and that's fine to have high standards for leaders, but I think we should acknowledge that everybody's a little bit of a mixed bag, and there's something that we can learn from every
Yeah.
leader. And I think the sooner we kind of appreciate that, the more we'll glean. Because I've had leaders that, frankly, I didn't like, and there's a lot about their leadership that I think is pretty crappy. But even those folks, they taught me not just things about myself, because a lot of times their strengths were my weaknesses, and sometimes I didn't
Hmm.
like that about
Yeah.
them, and kind of subconsciously. But there was a lot I could learn from them. And so that's one thing I would just point out, because I think a lot of us maybe miss out on opportunities to learn from even leaders that are kind of crappy, because we just disregard them as like, oh, that's a crappy leader, so I can't learn anything from them.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think sometimes we want to, oftentimes, especially among sometimes the younger people that I talk with, like this desire to be around, oh, I want to be around John Maxwell. And I think, great honor, but there's so many great leaders in everyday life. And oftentimes they're leaders that maybe don't get the notoriety, but really are super influential in the area wherever they serve and their leadership in their home. I mean, I've come across some people that I felt like were just phenomenal leaders that I could learn from, but they didn't have a big public platform. They didn't have, a podcast or a book or, a speaking circuit, but they were making a tremendous difference in the lives of everyday people. And there's some phenomenal things, like you said, that you can learn from those that are poor leaders as well. And I think no matter what, as leaders, I think that is key, is to continually be learning. Uh, if somebody were listening and they're like, well, I really want to grow as a leader and I'm not really sure where to turn, I know there's a ton of resources out there, but what would you say for maybe a young guy, or maybe a guy who's been around but never really been thoughtful about their leadership and would like to grow in it? What would you recommend they do to grow in their leadership capabilities?
I think one of the first things they could do is take some time to get to know themselves. I think a lot of uh, the best leaders are self-aware leaders.
Yeah.
So the first thing I would tell them to do before I know I'll talk a little bit about books and resources. There's a lot of great resources out there, but no one knows you like you know yourself. And so take some time to ask yourself questions. One of my favorite things to do is pull out the old classic 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, flip to the chapter where he's talking about start with the end in mind, go through the little funeral exercise. And what that will do is it forces you to think about your values. What do you want people to say about you at your hypothetical funeral? And so I think you start by taking some time to get to know yourself and orient yourself around your principles that are probably grounded in something, right? My principles that I gleaned when I did that exercise were pretty consistent with my faith principles,
Yeah.
because that's what's most important to me. That may not be what's most important to you, but just kind of getting to know yourself. And I think that's the starting point, and I think that's the consistent center of any great leader's self leadership. So holding yourself to your own principles, living a life of integrity where there's alignment between your deepest values and your schedule and your life,
Yeah.
because often our strongest desire is not our deepest desire. I really value, for example, fitness, But I don't think about that when it's, 9 o'clock at night and there's some ice cream in the freezer, so that's like at that moment, my strongest desire is to maybe eat something that's not necessarily helpful for my overall deepest desire, which is to live healthy and to be overall fit. So we have understanding our deepest desires is often helpful. The next thing I would say is, and you kind of already mentioned it, but I love everything that John Maxwell's ever written as a foundational starting point for leadership. I think some of his stuff on one, just go watch his videos, listen to his stuff. I think he does a great job, I think, of taking complex things about and nuanced things about leadership and making it very simple and easy to understand. So if you're a young leader and maybe you're just getting started, or maybe you're someone for the first time that's realizing that like leadership is its own area that I can grow with. I think a lot of people don't appreciate that you have to actually
Yeah,
grow. You gotta
got to grow.
make it an intentional part of your personal growth strategy to grow in leadership. It's not just something that happens. We do it. We commit to it. And yeah, I would start there. I mean, there's a lot of other things I could say, but that would be my initial. Is kind of get to know yourself, get to know, ask people around you to help you understand your strengths and weaknesses. Lean into your strengths. Understand your weaknesses so that other people can kind of help fill in those gaps, and then commit to kind of have a personal growth strategy and plan. And John Maxwell's a great place to start with that.
Yeah, I love how John Maxwell always uses his um, influence with leadership and the authority that he has in that arena to share his faith. He often
Mhm.
talks about that and how he takes that opportunity to share about how he's a Christ follower and that really influences his values and how he leads and just a he has had so much influence in our country and around the globe in raising up and training leaders. I could not be more thankful for that. Cal, you have started the intentional leader. How did that develop? How did you come to that play? I mean, you're there's a lot going on. You talked about ruthless elimination of hurry, and you have two kids, and caring. How did that come about to want to be able to help leaders grow by having your podcast, and then the ability to interview and to talk to other leaders? Tell me a little bit about that vision and even where you guys are headed.
Yeah, weirdly, it began with a long commute, Nate. I was in Texas. We were living right outside Austin, and I was working at an army base that was about an hour away from where we were living. And so every day I had 2 hours in the car where I was just with myself. And so I started just crushing audiobooks and podcasts. And so I used that time to really grow. And we already talked a little bit about having an actual plan, an intentional plan for growth, acknowledging that our minds kind of tend to, whatever we're focused on, it kind of expands over time. And so I was just learning about leadership, and a lot of the stuff I was listening to and consuming was leadership material, lots of leadership podcasts, leadership books. It was business books, it was faith-based books. And at that point, I had already graduated West Point. I'd already been a platoon leader, deployed. So I'd had some leadership experience, and I was a new attorney. And I just kind of felt like, and I don't know if it was a calling per se. I did kind of feel this dream, this kind of desire to share more of what I'd been learning. I was coming home and I was talking to my wife about, listen to this podcast today or read this book, and I don't, I don't know how Liz is for you, Nate, but my wife was very kind and she would listen and she would, act interested, but she was after a while, I think she was kind of thinking like, you need like an outlet. You have way too much that you want to talk about. Like maybe write a book or do a blog or something. So anyway, I had a friend who had a podcast, so I kind of knew that that was something you could do. And I think it was back in 2019. It was June. I finally just said, "Hey, I'm gonna start sharing some stuff on this podcast. I'm going to just." And so I started out with solo episodes where I would just hop on for 15 minutes and just take a topic that I had been thinking about or reading about or learning about, reflecting on, and I would just do 10, 15 minutes where I would share some principles on a particular topic. things like morning routine or habits or dealing with failure, setbacks,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. And then over time, I started doing interviews, and I'm as an attorney, I've always been a very curious person, and so we spend a lot of time asking questions. I've spent a lot of time in trial where we have to get information out of people, and I do think I have kind of a curious mind and an appreciation for questions, and I do enjoy listening to people and learning. And so I started doing more interviews, and this also happened to coincide with the pandemic, so people's speaking
Yes.
calendars were canceled, and so they were more available online. So anyway, I over time, I just really it's become more of a interview style podcast. That's why it's so weird for me to be on this side of the mic. But yeah, and so that's kind of what my heart is to learn, to grow, to let it be a facility, a place where people as leaders can grow. And it's been a lot of fun. And I'm honestly not sure where it's going to go. I've we could talk about ruthless elimination of hurry and some of the slowing down that I've done because it did kind of start to lead towards some burnout as I was trying to
Yeah.
manage all the stuff that you mentioned of new baby, hard job, commute, trying to make sure my faith was in a good place and spiritually in a healthy place. And so I've started to change some of my rhythms of rest. We Sabbath pretty a lot more intentionally now. I try to have a lot more space for meditation and reflection and thinking and praying and I've kind of started to appreciate that I do have limitations. I'm not a robot.
Yeah.
And so I'm still trying to figure out how I do what I think is a true calling, which is to kind of do intentional leader and be in the leadership space while making sure that my soul is in a good place.
Yeah. I understand that. So, Cal, when you're with your Intentional Leader podcast, who has been your one of your favorite guests? Because you've had some great ones on there, and I'm sure there was probably a couple that you were like, "Oh wow, I'm actually going to get to interview them. I'm super excited." Tell me a little bit about maybe one or two that were your favorite episodes.
I really enjoyed interviewing Patrick Lencioni. He was someone who he's one of my favorite authors, and the interview went really well, which was it was one of those interviews that because he was such a important author to me and kind of one of those heroes that you had never met, I probably over prepared for it. Although I don't think you can ever be too prepared, but it was one of those interviews where I was like rehearsing my questions and my responses to certain answers he might. So I was like very nervous going to that. I remember I was eating lunch with my wife and my mom who was in town right before, and I was trying to explain to them like how big this guy was to me. And at the end of the interview, he was so kind and so generous, and he even took a moment to just compliment the interview and just encourage people to go and share the podcast. And so it was a great interview substantively. Like I really enjoyed what he said. There's so many concepts that he talks about that really resonate with me from a leadership perspective. But then he also was just a delightful person. I appreciated that he surpassed my expectations just in terms of how kind he was, how generous he was. That's always nice when you actually get on the, you know how it is, Nate, you get on the mic with
Yeah.
some of the people when you do an interview and, before people hit record, sometimes, unfortunately, they're not exactly what you see when the recording is on. And
Yeah.
he was not at all that way. So I really enjoyed him. Another person I really enjoyed interviewing was General McChrystal, Stan McChrystal. He's just such a cool story and such a servant to our country, and just again, same kind of guy, just very personable, very kind, very generous with his time. Um, so those are a couple that stand out.
Both of those, definitely. I know my wife loves McChrystal, and um, Lencioni, his books have always been such an encouragement and challenge to me. I love, like you said, how his writing style is a little bit different than some of the leaders out there, and really enjoy the way he writes. And he's always entertaining too. If you hear him speak, he can
He's a great
he can
speaker.
throw some things out there that is super funny and entertaining. So thank you for sharing those guys. And Cal, I mean, I would definitely encourage anybody that's listening to this to check out your podcast. You guys do such a great work. We really are so honored to have you on our show. Thank you for taking time to jump on and share a little bit about your own journey in leadership and what you've learned. We could probably talk for another 2 or 3 hours about leadership, and there's so many things and that nuances that you can talk about in different areas of leadership. And definitely thank you for sharing your faith and how your faith is important to you and how that impacts and influences your leadership. And again, we're so thankful for your service to our country, and look forward to hopefully having you back on the show sometime. But thanks for being on with us today.
Well, thanks, Nate. And you told me a little bit about what you guys are doing, and I just am so encouraged by that. I think, especially as men, we tend towards isolation. I think there's something in us that a lot of times we feel like either sharing our stuff is a burden on people, or we just don't have time for it, or just don't make time for it. So I love what you're doing. I'm so encouraged by it. It's an honor to be on. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Cal. God bless.
You, brother.